Hello everyone, thanks for joining us. It's 2 o'clock, so we'll get started. Thanks to everyone who's joined us. We've got a pretty big list of participants today, and more along the way, but we're going to get started anyway. This webinar is a result of a joint effort by the National Collaborating Center for Healthy Public Policy and the National Collaborating Center for Environmental Health. Before we get started, we just want to do a few details. First of all, we're recording this webinar, and that includes the chat. You'll see the chat box on the right at the bottom. Both the PowerPoint that we're using today and the recording of the webinar will be available on the website of NCCHPP. We will send a note to everyone, an email either tonight or tomorrow, with the links to those. We will also send links to an evaluation form and a means for you to get continuing education credits if you so desire. Should you have any technical trouble, please send a note to Mylène McGuire, who's here to help us out today, and we want to thank Mylène. She helps enormously, makes it a lot easier for us. Okay, we have a great many people on the line, and as a result, we're going to use the chat box for your interaction, and we really do want to ensure that people use that often. We have 8 Canadian provinces and a couple of territories on the line. We have people from the US, UK, from Norway and Cyprus, as far as I know. There is also a lot of expertise among you. We could tell that from where you were coming from, and we would strongly encourage you to share that expertise with others on the line. We'll do our best to follow everything that's going on in the chat, and we will try to respond as appropriate. But please don't hesitate. Okay, 3 of us will be presenting today. I'm Michael Keeling, and I'm here in Montreal with my colleague Olivier Belflave. We're with the NCCHPP, and we're very happy to be joined by Anne-Marie Nicol, who's at the National Collaborating Center for Environmental Health, and she's calling in from Vancouver.
Hello everyone from the West Coast.
7 degrees and rainy, I believe, isn't it?
It is.
None of us have a conflict of interest to declare. Now, very briefly, the National Collaborating Centers for Public Health, there are 6. We make up 2 of them. They're in different parts of the country, and each has a different subject of interest. These are financed by the Public Health Agency of Canada. When we asked you to sign up for, when you signed up for this webinar, we asked you a few questions about just to gauge your level of knowledge about radon and about ethics. So here's a very condensed breakdown of your responses, fairly normal distribution curves, but we used what you said when we were developing this webinar. Very briefly, what our goals are today are essentially we want to talk about radon, we want to think with an ethical perspective, and we want to give you access to resources. Obviously, we're limited in what we can do during 1 hour, but we'll do as much as we can, and we will leave you with resources and an invitation to contact us with further questions if you have any, and to get to know what's on our website. During the course of this webinar, we're going to present and then use a fictional case study. The reason we're going to do this, one, we want to stimulate discussion. We want to give you a realistic scenario to help to focus our thoughts about radon and give it some meaning. And we want to give you a place to practice raising ethical issues using a framework. It's not really going to be our goal to solve the issues that case presents today. More important that we actually raise the issues in the first place and think about what they are. With that, we will get started on that, and I will pass the microphone over to Olivier.
Thanks, Mike. So we'll start with our problem. So radon, as you know or as you'll learn today, is the 2nd leading cause of lung cancer in Canada and the leading cause among non-smokers. And despite this, Canadians know very little about radon, the risks it poses to their health, and what they can do about it. We'll ask you to imagine during this webinar that your provincial government has sent a letter to all daycares owners and managers to inform them about radon and to ask them to test their facilities for radon. 6 months later, very few have done the testing. So faced with such a problem, we now have to decide what we should do. And as you know, a lot of factors can influence our decision because they affect how the problem is framed, our motivation, the information we have, or how we justify our decision. We have listed a few of such factors on this slide, like our values, the legal environment, professional standards, and so on and so forth. I'm sure you can think of other factors that can affect our decision making. Please don't hesitate to share them using the chat box. Today we'll focus mainly on scientific evidence and ethical analysis. So here's just one possible response to our problem, and we are going to use it as a case study today. Imagine that your public health unit has been asked to comment on a proposed law that would require daycare to test for radon, post the results as they are visible from the outside, and do the remedial work to obtain or review their operating license. To raise awareness about radon amongst parents, workers, and the public, the law will require daycares to post the result of their test using a traffic light system with a green, meaning a test result below Health Canada's guideline, a yellow, a result over the guideline, and a red for results way over the guideline. Many daycare owners are worried that they would lose clients and that they may even have to close their business, which could have major impacts on children and families, especially in lower income neighborhoods. Okay, so you just heard about the problem and our case for that today. So we'll come back to it in a bit, but at first glance, do you think your organization should support the law? Please just vote now. Wait a few seconds. Okay, so interesting to see that most people are for the proposal, and we have also a lot of maybe. So perhaps more time to think about it, or some changes are needed in the proposal. That's very interesting. As I said, we'll come back to our case in a few minutes to analyze it from an ethical perspective. But in the meantime, Anne-Marie Nicole will share some of her expertise about radon with us. So, up to you, Anne-Marie.
Thank you. I'm going to start just with a brief background about radon and confirming what was said earlier, that radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer worldwide after smoking and the leading cause in non-smokers. And a number of international agencies support this recommendation, including IARC, which is the French International Agency for Research on Cancer. It's a known human carcinogen, or a group 1 carcinogen. And in 2010, the International Commission on Radiological Protection actually reevaluated the risk from radon and suggested that it's quite a bit higher than they had previously calculated in 1993. So there is a growing awareness overall that radon poses a more significant health risk than we had previously thought. So radon is part of the natural decay chain of uranium. And as uranium breaks down over time, it releases radon gas. And the gas makes it mobile, and it allows it to move through the soil in a way that uranium historically has not. And as radon itself is part of the decay chain, it also releases radiation as it breaks down. And so over time, radon releases up to 4 alpha particles in its own decay process. And I'd just like to say thank you to Dr. Erin Godarzi, who is the Canada's Research Chair on Instability Disease, who's helped provide me with some of these slides. So as radon is a gas, it can move through soil, and it can move through places with pressure differentials between the ground and a home or building. And this allows radon to move from underground up into basements or ground level contacts, and then up into upper floors as well. Radon is also soluble in water, and where water is an issue in homes with high concentrations, radon can be released, the gas itself can be released when water comes in contact with air, and that includes not only in kitchens but also in showers, and so levels can build up in bathrooms as well. So the estimated burden of lung cancer-related, radon-related lung cancer has been estimated by Health Canada, and they've come up with approximately 3,300 Canadians each year they believe die from radon-related lung cancer. And just this year, Public Health Ontario also estimated between 1,000 and 1,500 new cancer cases, this is each year, are attributable to radon exposure. In the United States, they also estimate that radon-related lung cancers cause more mortality than drunk driving accidents. So how does radon lead to lung cancer? As radon decays in the lungs and the respiratory tract, it releases alpha radiation, and that radiation essentially acts like a cannon and rips through DNA in a way that makes it more difficult for the DNA to repair itself. So there's different kinds of strand breaks in DNA. There's single and double strand breaks, but the kind of clustered damage that's caused by radon in the lining of the lungs, the cells in the lining of the lungs, are quite a bit more difficult to repair. And over time, that increased DNA damage can lead to increase in errors in repair and genetic mutations, and this is what leads to the development of cancer. So how much damage does an alpha particle really do? This is just a picture that was provided for me from a Health Canada colleague that shows the plastic chip from a radon test device, and it actually shows the pitting that occurs when the alpha radiation hits the plexiglass piece in the radon test device. You can see actual physical damage from radon, and this is at 3 months of the U.S. guideline of 150 becquerels, which is our unit that we measure radon in, and this is actually less than the current Health Canada guideline. So after 3 months, this is the accumulated amount of damage emitted by the particles and the alpha radiation as radon decays. One of the interesting things about radon is that the majority of Canadians are still unaware of it. So Statistics Canada does the Household and Environment Survey every 2 years, and they've been tracking radon since 2009. And you can see that in most provinces there has been some uptick in people's ability to accurately describe radon gas and its concomitant dangers, but we're still looking at less than 50%, even less than 40% of the overall population who understand what radon is and how it poses a health risk. More troubling is the statistic that very few people have actually tested their homes for radon, and it is a colorless, odorless, tasteless gas, and as a result, the only way that you can know if it's in your home or your workplace is to test for it. So we see across the country less than 10% of people have actually tested their residences for radon. One of the questions that we frequently get asked is, are children more at risk from radon exposure than adults? And so the research from radiation in general shows that children are more vulnerable to radiation exposure, although those kinds of studies have not done specifically for radon gas exposure. So we don't have clear studies that point to whether or not radon is more of a problem, particularly for children. There have been some studies looking at leukemia and blood cancers, although the database is not complete. So there is some weak evidence that suggests that children may be more at risk from leukemia, and other studies that have null findings. So really the research is ongoing as to whether or not children can develop leukemia from radon exposure. One of the other questions that is confounding that relationship is, when would you actually be concerned about exposure? Would that be in utero or during the first few years? So some of the study designs haven't been set well enough to understand different timing windows for radiation exposure. However, overall, the bottom line is that as radiation exposure is cumulative over the lifetime, reducing exposure during early years is important because it reduces overall radon burden. So just to give you a sense of where we're at in Canada, our current guideline, and this is a guideline and not a law, it is recommended to be 200 becquerels per meters cubed. In the United States, it's a little less, it's 150, and the WHO recommends half. And that's because radon is what's considered a linear relationship in that any elevated exposure above background contributes to the increase in lung cancer. And this graph here shows that over time, as exposure increases, the relative risk of developing lung cancer increases. And the profile is different for both smokers and non-smokers, with non-smokers being more at risk from radon exposure than smokers. In Ontario, they did a calculation to determine how many lives they could save if we tested and remediated at the Health Canada guideline of 200. So in 1 year, they estimated they could save 91 lung cancer cases. However, that's more than doubled if we lower the guideline to 100 becquerels or the WHO guideline. This is a radon potential map. So this is not actual measures in people's homes, but this is measurements of the potential for radon to occur. And you can see that radon is most likely to be present in many of the regions across the country. So Zone 1 is elevated or high levels of potential for radon. Zone 3, the blue levels, we still do see homes that have elevated levels of radon in those regions, but the red levels have a higher proportion of homes that will test over those guideline levels. So what can we do about radon in homes and buildings? There are things that you can do. Because it is a colorless and odorless gas, you do have to test for it. And testing is recommended in areas where people spend more than 4 hours. And this is why we're interested not just in homes, but also in schools and institutions, and as well as correctional facilities. We require testing, remediation, and retesting as part of the process for reducing radon exposure. And there are a number of different options, including systems that can be put into homes and buildings that actually reduce the radon. I'm going to show some pictures of those in a minute. You can also seal floors and cracks to prevent the ingress of the gas from the soil into a building. And there's also temporary measures where people are concerned if they come back with high levels and they would like to reduce their risk immediately. You can move people to bedrooms in higher levels and increase ventilation in rooms where you suspect there's a problem. In new homes and building, it's a bit different. There's changes to the building code that are now directing builders to build radon out. So start systems in which people can much more easily prevent radon from coming into their home by attaching an active system. There's different ways that you can test. You can also hire a professional to test, or you can test yourself. The alpha track detector is the cheapest and simplest, and a long-term test really essentially means more than 91 days. So you can pick up these sorts of tests from lung associations and also hardware stores, or you can hire a professional to come. The Canadian government does certify professional testers and remediators, so you can feel confident that the people that are doing the testing have been trained adequately. And you can also use continuous radon monitors both to test your home and once you have a system in place to ensure that your system is accurately working. This is a picture of what's known as subslab depressurization, and it is one of the ways of removing radon from a home. And there's a pipe that goes underground to where there's gravel. This draws the gas up, and a fan is attached that exhausts the radon outside. And in British Columbia, our building code actually now in Zone 1, where we know that radon levels are elevated in at least 20% of homes, this system is built in without this active fan. And homeowners have to test, and then they can put a fan in if their levels are elevated. And this is just a picture of what that might look like. You can see it would be down in a utility room. And it's important to seal all the ground contact areas. So again, these are just photographs of homes where they've had to seal to prevent the gas ingress. And this is the system going through. And things like sump pumps also have to be sealed to prevent the gas from leaking in. There are a number of regulatory initiatives that are going on in Canada, although just to remember that our recommended guideline of 200 becquerels is simply that, a recommendation, and there are no legal requirements currently to test. New building codes also, while they require you to build in the partial systems, don't require testing so that people can actually know whether or not they need to build those systems through and put in a fan. So reducing exposure during early life, I believe, is an effective way of reducing overall lifetime risk. And so in my work, I've been focusing on reducing childhood exposure, looking at both school and daycare testing. So to date, Quebec is the only province that actually has mandatory school testing, although other provinces have, on their own initiative, tested all schools, but this is not consistent across the country. There are other potential regulatory initiatives that are going on. In Ontario, they're reviewing changes to rental tenancy with the thought to incorporate radon testing into rental tenancy codes so that tenants could ask landlords to deal with the radon problem if levels were elevated. Real estate transactions in the United States, there are requirements in some states to have radon be part of real estate transactions. This is not yet current in Canada. Also, home inspection is an opportunity for new purchasers to ask whether or not radon levels have been tested in a home. And in Ontario, there is a warranty for new homes that allows homeowners, if they do test, to claim the costs of a remediation system if the tests are elevated. So that was a very brief survey through what radon is and some of the ways that you can fix it. Are there any questions at this point in time? There seems to be a lot of chat going on. So, and I know there's lots of experts on the line so who are actual radon remediators.
Anne-Marie, we were keeping track of the chat as you presented.
Okay.
A couple of questions came up. If you want to, you could look in the chat, or we could just read out a couple.
Why don't you read them out, because I see it's quite long.
Okay. One question early on from Mark, it was what would be the acceptable risk?
What is the acceptable
risk?
Sorry, what is the acceptable risk?
Yeah.
Mark, is that a question in terms of mortality?
He's typing now.
This is a fascinating question because in Canada, for chemical risks, we regulate 1 in 100,000 to 1 in a million as an acceptable de minimis risk. So radon by far exceeds the kinds of risks that we regulate chemicals to.
Anne-Marie, in the chat, Mark has typed, I meant that more as an answer to the question of why we would not be more proactive.
Yes, so in my personal point of view, I believe that ALERA, so as low as reasonably achievable, is what we should be aiming for in Canada. When we look at how much lung cancer is contributed from radon levels, even between 100 and 200, we know that because so many people exist in that zone with their homes measuring between 100 and 200, that the lung cancer cases are significant. So reducing the regulatory level to at least 100 would, in my personal opinion, would be helpful.
There's another question here in the chat. It would be interesting to ask, it's just moving right now. It would be interesting to ask the parents that put their children into daycare under good faith that the facility is safe, that the license deems it safe, what their acceptable risk level is. That might be interesting to comment on in light of how low awareness is about radon.
Yes, I believe if you ask parents if their children should be allowed to be exposed to a radioactive gas, they might have some interesting responses. The current guideline is 200 becquerels.
Okay. Got a couple of people typing here. We'll just wait a moment and see if there are a couple more questions on the way or if we're going to move on.
One person asked earlier, who should pay for remediation? I thought it was a good question. Not sure you have the answer, but it's a good question. You can keep in mind perhaps for the ethical analysis of the case.
So was that a question directed at me, or there's other people? I see other people are responding. Health Canada estimates the risk of developing lung cancer for a non-smoker is about 1 in 20.
Okay,
I see Greg timing in 1 in 50. So yes, this is huge compared to any other. The next closest environmental exposure we have is arsenic.
Okay, I
200
think we're going to
becquerels
move on.
yes, I
thanks,
think we
Anne-Marie.
probably should. There's lots of chat going on.
Let the chat continue, and
Okay.
what we can look through it afterwards. Maybe we'll put some onto our website. But in any case, you can respond to the chat as we go, Anne-Marie.
Okay, I'll point people to, the
You can
U.S. has some great tables, so I'll point people to those.
And we can have conversations going on the side as we continue.
Okay.
Okay? All right. Now we'll pass it over to Olivier.
Okay, so now we'll talk a bit more about the ethical dimension of decision making. So why should we take an interest in public health ethics? Well, if it is clear that professionalism requires that we know the health effects of radon, how to prevent exposure, the relevant guidelines and best practices, and the regulatory environments, we must also pay attention to the effects of our actions on groups and individuals, recognize which values are promoted and which are diminished by our actions, and be able to deliberate about options, weighing the good and the bad, making decisions and justifying them. And ethics can help in these regards. So in a nutshell, that's why we should take an interest in public health ethics. There are various approaches and tools that can be used that can help us to see and think about ethical issues. For instance, some professions have codes of ethics, but there are also ethical values, principles, ethical frameworks, case studies, theoretical approaches, intuitions, and let's not forget, some may also prefer to use nothing or not to think about those things at all. It's an option. But for those who care about ethical issues, it is important to realize that we can look for issues at different levels or scales. Chances are the issues will be quite different at the macro level, where we look at public policies and population health, compared to what we might find at the micro level, where we look at individuals' interests and values. These three perspectives, macro, meso, and micro, are not mutually exclusive, and they are all important. So when possible, it is better to think about all of them. Today we'll use a framework to analyze our case, and we'll also touch upon a code of ethics. So since many of you today are probably affiliated with the Canadian Institute of Public Health Inspectors, you know that SciFi defines professionalism through 4 components, and that one of them is a code of ethics that should inform decision making. This code of ethics, like many others, is based on principles. This one involves promoting justice, being accountable, maintaining privacy and confidentiality, promoting evidence-informed decision-making, promoting health, well-being, and collaboration, and competent practice. All of these are clearly important for those, and for those of you who are already using Code of Ethics, we invite you to keep it in mind and inform the analysis of our case. In SciFi's Standards of Practice, it says that public health inspectors demonstrate the ethical standard by identifying ethical issues and communicating them. This is where we think using an ethical framework might prove to be very useful. And one of the reasons why frameworks are so useful is that they are very accessible. A framework is a guide that can help you identify and deal with ethical issues, and you don't need to be an expert to use one. But it will only help you. It won't do the work for you, especially when it comes to critical thinking, and this is very crucial. Since about the year 2000, many ethical frameworks have been developed for public health, and we'll try out one today as an example of what a framework can do. There's a link at the end of our presentation that leads to a list of about 25 frameworks to choose from. So feel free to browse through them after the webinar, and you should be able to find one that suits you.
Thanks, Olivier. What we would like to do with the bulk of the time that remains to us, and I see we've got about half an hour, is to consider the case that we started this webinar with, and then let's try to consider what some of the ethical issues might be that can emerge from that, using a framework that is fairly well known and has been around for about 15 years. Just to refresh our memory, the main elements in this case that we presented at the start, for a daycare operator, in order to obtain or renew the license for a daycare, it would be necessary to undertake radon testing, to post the results such that they're visible from outside the building, and if there are elevated radon levels, to undertake remedial work within the time limits as outlined by Health Canada. I'll just give you the details on that again. It would involve a system of traffic lights. If you're under 200 becquerel per cubic meter, then you'd get a green light, which is to say, okay, good to go. If you're between 200 and 600 becquerels, you'd get a yellow light, and you would have 2 years to undertake remediation. And if you had a red light, it would mean you were over 600 becquerels in the testing, and remedial work had to be done within a year. So that's the case. We propose going through the framework proposed by CAS. We chose this framework because it's relatively short and relatively straightforward. It's also very well known. It involves just 6 questions. And one reason we also chose it is because it's very compatible with the code of ethics that Sci-Fi uses. Because when CAS poses these questions, it's up to the person who's responding to the questions to consider the values that are underlying the question and the things that are drawn out from it. So the values in Sci-Fi's framework are certainly compatible with the use of, Sci-Fi's code of ethics are quite compatible with this framework. We did not choose this framework because we want you to use it in your daily work. We simply brought this one up as an example that one could use. We don't favor this one over others, but it's proven quite useful. We do recommend, though, that people check out what's out there. If they're considering using a framework to do ethics work, check out what's out there, try some out, see what works, see what suits your situation best, and maybe even adapt it as needed. So we will run through the questions. The first couple of questions are very specific, and I'll speak to those, but then we're planning to open it up, and we're going to have you do more of the thinking and more of the typing. So we're going to try to solicit a bit of ethical analysis from the group who's here, currently 80 or so people. So the first question that Nancy Cass asked, what are the public health goals of the proposed program? It's very simple, but also very important. She's asking us to determine what is the ultimate goal of this, why are we doing it? And in this case, I think the ultimate and long-term goal would simply be to reduce morbidity and mortality caused by radon. We can all agree to that as a reasonable goal. However, what we'll see in a moment is that for a goal like this, there are a number of ways of getting there, and different ways may have different costs attached. And so what we do when we analyze the ethics of this case, we look at what different potential options may do, how they may affect others. So there may be ethical and other costs that are attached to achieving this goal, and we're going to try to sort out what some of those are. The second question that Nancy Cass asked is, how effective is the program in achieving those goals? Now, this is a really big question. It's more or less the question of effectiveness, and it's not one that we can answer completely in the time we've got today, and it would be a big job. However, what we can do is we can look at ways in which you could start to approach such a question if you were working through the ethics of a case. So one way to start is by outlining the logic of the intervention in a kind of step-by-step fashion, just to see how the actions that you're proposing will lead you to the goal or to where you want to end up. So the 3 yellow blocks represent what would be required under this provincial law which is proposed. It requires that all daycares be tested, that the results be posted, and that if necessary, the remedial work would be undertaken within the period of time required. If those things happen, the logic has it that that would lead to a reduction of radon, and that in turn would lead to reduced morbidity and mortality. But let's note here that the people affected are the children in the daycare, the workers and the managers who are in the daycare as well. So I think in this case we could identify a second dimension to this program. And I think this is one of the main goals of posting the results outside the building. When you post the results on the outside of the building, what we've seen, people talk about how it's partially intended as an awareness campaign. Not only does it make the results of the testing clear, but it also provides a means to raise awareness about the issue of radon, not just with parents, but with the public. So a secondary dimension of this law would be that it is potentially something that could lead to people testing their own homes. And here we have a much bigger part of the population. If that kind of thing could translate to people testing their own homes, and by extension, once they've tested their homes, doing the remedial work, and so on, leading ultimately to reduced morbidity and mortality. That would be the goal, or at least the logic of what this intervention would be intending to do. So when we lay out the structure of an intervention like this, we can start to see where certain issues apply at certain points. Given that the program is intended to be mandatory, you can see how the logic would indeed lead to reduction of radon in daycare. However, as we saw from Anne-Marie's slides, the general awareness about radon is quite low, and even when people become aware of radon, the level, the percentage of people who do the testing is quite low, and among the people who do the testing, the percentage who do the remediation is quite low. So the second part, where parents and public are made aware, that may be weaker in terms of leading to the outcome that is sought, just to show that that's a potential issue. So at this point, we're going to move on to the third question that Nancy Cass asks, and I'm going to turn it over to you, and I will try to present it, and then we'll see if we can get some responses so that the ethical analysis is coming from people across the country and elsewhere. Before that, here are just a couple of little points about, these are connected to the links between parents and public and testing their own homes. But we'll move on. Okay, the third question from Nancy Cass is, what are the known or potential burdens of the program? So this is the other side of the ledger. We have the public health goal, reducing morbidity and mortality. So now we have to consider the burdens so that we can balance the one against the other. So I'll ask everyone to start thinking about what are the risks to privacy and confidentiality, to liberty and self-determination, to justice, and to individuals' health. I'll give you a moment to think and type. I see one question from above. Olivier just pointed this out. Esther asked, is it appropriate to use an acute warning system, i.e. the traffic lights, for chronic exposure problem? That's a really good point, and I think it has the effect of highlighting an issue, but maybe in a way that will produce more stress. And if people are not well informed about how radon works and how it's a long-term effect that it produces, it could lead to extreme reactions, including extreme stress. That's a really interesting point. Thank you.
Related to that, Greg and Anita someone else said, actually in a school, parents reacted by retracting their students from the school instead of testing their homes.
Really? Okay. Daycares in lower income neighborhoods would be less likely to be able to comply, perhaps leading to inequitable loss of daycare. That's a very good point. That'll become even more highlighted in question, I think, 5. If a parent does not know a single, just think it's something that happens because of proximity. Daycare struggle as is. Individual homeowners may not be able to pay for remediation. That's a burden, obviously. And it's not always clear upon whom the burden of remediation would fall either. If somebody's renting a space in order to operate a daycare, they may end up having to invest money in a building that's owned by someone else, or it's not entirely clear how that would play out. But there's no mention here of any cost sharing in terms of the remediation or tax breaks or anything else. Ditto for homeowners, and ditto for renters for that matter.
Somebody asked a question about the cost of remediation. I was wondering if Anne-Marie Nicole could give us an idea of the range of costs for different settings. Could give people a better idea.
Hello, Anne-Marie's back. Actually, I believe there's people on the chat who can speak to the cost of remediation better than I can for buildings. I know for homes there's various estimates for how much a subslab depressurization system is to put in a home. But what I would like to point out is that regardless of how high the level is, the cost is usually, unless the house is particularly has some attributes to it that's unique, the costs are about the same even if the levels are in the thousands or in the 600. So it doesn't usually cost that much more to bring a high house down to an appropriate level. So, oh, here Pam is writing in now.
$1,500 to $5,000 for a home. Okay, thank you, Pam. Seeing a few trends in the responses right now. I'm seeing some things about cost and the burden of cost. I'm seeing some people responding in terms of the scarcity of daycare and the stress and pressure that can put on some families. I'm also seeing comments about risk and keeping that in mind that, look, this is a risk of cancer and that needs to be borne in mind. Let's keep thinking along those lines as we move on to the next question. So we're thinking about potential burden and the risks. And we continue with that notion by asking, how can the burdens be minimized? And if there are alternative approaches. Just to get us started, certainly one thing that would be necessary here, given the general level of awareness about radon, communication efforts would have to be very significant. One, in order to inform people about how radon exposure is a long-term and chronic related risk. So they've opened up a situation in which it could be 1 or 2 years before it can be mitigated. They put the sign in the window. It needs to be combined with communication. That would, to a certain extent, it could minimize the burden for some. Provision of rebate for radon testing and remediation by government. That's one way of doing it. There's a comment about the cost of lung cancer, what it costs government. Well, that's from Anne-Marie. Some comments in here about healthcare costs.
Anne-Marie's weighing in on the cost of the direct costs of treating lung cancer include direct medical costs from the system. There's also what's known as indirect and then intangible costs, which are quite a bit higher. But in terms of the direct costs to medical services per province for the kinds of healthcare costs for one fatal lung cancer, it's approximately, and that's on average, $55,000. Given how fatal lung cancer is, people tend not to live very long.
Okay. Lots of education, says Lambton Public Health. Indeed. Dave Tamblin, another burden is the anxiety caused in the community. People don't accept any risk. Sure, and in terms of alternative approaches, there are considerations. Maybe a whole different program would be in order. That's not necessarily what I'd be advocating here, but just to say that this question can be expanded a little to think about, okay, is this the right way to minimize the burden that we see coming up as a result? Incentive programs. An example from BC about switching out to better wood stoves that produce less air emissions, a grant program. Sure, in terms of mitigation.
There's a good question by Greg and Anita. It says, from an ethics point, how will the daycare licensing agent feel about undisclosed known high levels? And does this uncountable for justify not testing? That is a very good question. When you know the risk is high and you're responsible for licensing a home care or a daycare, what should you do and how to take into account this discomfort?
These are big issues because one good is being weighed against another, and if the two cannot be made to fit together harmoniously, then it's a choice between losing daycare spaces and making sure that they're healthy. And sometimes the situation will play out like that. So it's a really good point. Okay. We'll keep those coming, and I will move on to the next question that Cass poses, and this one's about fairness. So we've talked about the burdens and how they can be minimized. There's another question related to whether or not the program is being implemented fairly. So, given the burden, given the benefits, are they being distributed fairly? Are the right people taking the weight? Are they the same people who benefit? Will the program increase or decrease inequalities? Very important point, and it's very much in the discourse in public health these days. Let's not increase inequalities. Should the program be universal? Should it target certain populations? Is there a risk of stigmatizing certain groups? Again, we'll turn to the chat. One thing to note, and some of you have already pointed towards this, but we need to note that Radon does not discriminate. And it may affect one daycare and not another, but some daycares may have more resources to deal with it. There will be some daycares that have the financial resources and have super proactive parents, and they will act right away. And if they have to put a sign in the window, you know that they're going to be reacting very quickly to make sure that they can assure parents that the air is okay. There are other daycares that won't have those resources available, and they may not have the same level of information and awareness. Christine, good point. Stigmatizing parents whose children go to the daycare as bad parents. That's right, and it's a 2-year window with a yellow light. So if someone has the choice to continue going to that daycare or not, and there are other options available, and options come with resources, it may be much more difficult for others to get out of that, and so they'll be stigmatized, whereas the ones with more resources may not be. Inequalities will definitely be increased. Another point that's related to fairness, as your employer tested your workspace? Good question. Another notion that comes to mind as we think about fairness, we know from other areas of public health that information campaigns do not work on different people in the same way, in that people from higher socioeconomic groups tend to benefit more from health information campaigns than do those from lower SES groups. And so here, the secondary part of the Radon program here, it will tend to benefit those who are better off. That's a tendency. I won't say that would happen for sure, but certainly we've seen that tendency elsewhere. Another issue is that smoking is a Anne-Marie could speak to this better than me, but smoking is a risk factor when combined with radon. It has a multiplying effect. Well, there it is. Anne-Marie's just writing that now. Lower SDS have higher smoking rates. Go ahead, Anne-Marie.
Yes. So what we know about smoking trends is that smoking rates are higher in low SES families, and low socioeconomic families do tend to access daycares to a higher level, at least in provinces outside of Quebec. I can't, because we don't have the same kind of universal child care programs in the rest of the country. So you've already got a population at higher risk going into a radon-prone facility. So I believe that the concept of socioeconomic status is still significant for this.
For sure. Thank you. These are really good comments that are coming through, and it's a little hard to keep up. We're going to boldly forge ahead, though. We're just going to pass over this next question, but I will certainly present the question. Comments are welcome, but we're going to just keep moving. This is where it gets really interesting, and we try to balance the benefits and the burdens of the program. This involves doing the hard work of deciding what to do, while keeping in mind that the greater the burden imposed by a program, and it's up to us to identify the burden, and it often takes help from others who are in affected communities rather than just imagining that we know ourselves. But the greater must be the expected public health benefits. So this takes us right back to number one. What are the public health goals? How effective is it in doing it? This is where we put things together and try to make a choice about what to do. And we'll just pass it by at this point. So, given that very brief discussion of radon and that very brief pass-through using Cass's framework, we'd like to test it again and just see if people are still in support of the law. We took the 42, 44 to 20. A little bit different. Oh, it looks like yes and maybe have kind of switched places. 33 and 54. Okay, so very quickly, it looks like yes and maybe switched places. The first poll, it was 52% yes, 32% maybe, and now it's about 30% yes and 55 maybe. That's interesting. Half an hour of work has shifted things a little. Okay, let's take a moment here and we'll try to respond to any more questions that come up. It could be about radon, it could be about frameworks. Olivia and I in particular would be very interested to hear your comments about working with that framework, whether that's useful, whether it's missing things, whether the emphasis was in the right places to help you think about ethical issues. What are we seeing? Some comments about testing in schools. I may have missed that, but was it about why test daycares and not schools? Yeah? Okay.
It was interesting also that someone raised the question whether it would be better to test daycares or test homes, which would be more effective or cost-effective.
Okay, good point.
It's Anne-Marie here. I think one of the reasons for testing daycares over schools, if you had to prioritize, is that children tend to spend a longer time in a daycare. A school is usually 9 to 3, and daycares can be open anywhere from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. So in terms of the overall time spent in a daycare facility, also children tend to spend more time indoors in daycares than they do in schools.
Okay. And here's a comment from Charlene about the burden of holding a license. It means that the operator meets the threshold for health and safety. So there's certainly a role to play in the assessment of risk and requiring mitigation. Not sure about the need to post the results. And that's quite interesting. This case was partially inspired by a law in Illinois. in which they require testing and they require that the information be made available, but they do not require mitigation. That's right, Olivier?
Yeah.
You're more familiar with that one.
There are a few examples in the U.S., but that one, yes.
So informed consent presumably being a big part of it, and freedom, liberty being another. We're going to keep an eye on the questions as we continue. We just want to, before we sign off, we'd like to show you a couple of slides with further resources that you could find. Here are some resources on Radon from the National Collaborating Center for Environmental Health, a few resources. They've got a great page which was recently updated, and it's got a lot of material on it, so we recommend that. And a few other resources on Radon, some of which we consulted in preparing this. Here are some links to NCCHPP work on public health ethics. Olivia mentioned earlier that we have a repertoire of ethics frameworks. We've got a list of 25 or so, and we also provide links to the original documents where they're available. In some cases, we've summarized some of these frameworks into very short versions that are either good for helping your memory about what the main points are, or maybe good for using in a small group that you could combine with cases. Anyway, there are some NCCHPP resources. And one final point, we're going to send an email to everyone at the end with a link to the evaluation form for this webinar. If you do wish to receive continuing education credits, that's the way to get to the page for requesting that. And as I said, we will put everything online in the very near future. And we thank you so much for joining us. We've got 2 or 3 minutes still on the line, so we could continue talking. And if there are more questions, we'd be happy to discuss. A couple minutes left though before we sign off. I haven't been able to read the chat, so I'm just going to take a look now.
There's lots of questions here, or lots of comments about how we could fund programs for daycares that are above guidelines, and having grants available similar that you would have them for other kinds of infrastructure changes to allow people to access money for funding for changing daycares.
That seems to be a really good response to creating the obligation to test and then fix.
Yes.
If there are the means to help people fix, all the better. A great idea. What do people think about the posting the signs in the window? I saw one person mention that it wasn't good. They weren't for it. What are other people's comments about that?
A few people were reluctant to this part of the program.
Yeah?
Yeah.
It's
it was maybe the biggest weakness of the program.
Okay.
My point for that is in Ontario, when you go out to eat, they often have stickers in the windows that tell you when public health inspectors were there last and that the facility has passed an inspection. And I see the sticker in the window as a corollary idea for Radon.
I was wondering how I would react if I lived next to a daycare and I saw a red sticker in that daycare and going home next to it.
I see one person mentioning for real estate transactions as well.
Yes,
I don't know if that's about property values or if that's about disclosure of information. Either one is pertinent, certainly.
I think, Michael, for your point, if the warning was, there was a warning, then it could also have some information below it saying residences in the region are also encouraged to test.
Yep. Education and awareness. If the general knowledge base is so low, I personally think the signage would be a good thing.
Health Canada has been trying since 2007 to educate Canadians, and these are 2013 statistics. So whatever's happening in terms of education and awareness certainly isn't working to have any action.
It's very interesting how low the uptake is. I mean, even with the most basic awareness about what radon is,
it's true. This month is Radon Action Month. I'm not sure how many people on the call know that this is Radon Action Month, but Health Canada is supporting this month to try to increase awareness?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. That was how we actually chose this case for November as well, so it was in harmony with that.
I think it's interesting. Someone says that posting a sign in the window will actually force the daycare to remediate according to the Health Canada guidelines, and ask what is the ethical dilemma of that?
Oh, to do it now rather than to wait the whole 2 years.
No, I think, well, one of the things that we try to elicit with the framework is to question whether there are ethical dilemma. It's possible there is not, but from the question that we saw in the chat, people are thinking about stigmatization, inequality, and all of other problems that could go with the action. So that just to take them into account while taking the decision to go forward or not with the program.
I see we've reached 3 o'clock Eastern, and we promised you an hour, so we should sign off, even though we'd like to keep talking a bit. But we do invite people to contact us by email. We would be happy to continue the conversation, and we do hope that you'll take a moment to fill out the evaluation forms as well. Particularly the comments that people make in those forms, we really do use those. Comments for what worked, what didn't, comments about what we ought to work on. That stuff is really important to helping guide our work. So with that, I want to thank Anne-Marie for joining us. It's been great to have you here, and we really needed your expertise on this call. And thanks to Olivia and Elaine.
Thank you for choosing radon as a topic, because there are a lot of ethical issues associated with testing and remediating, and even education and awareness. So I appreciate that.
Radon.
Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Okay, thank you all, and have a good day.